In this video, we are going to talk about flotation of matter in liquids. So our learning target for today is to determine when an object will float using density. So we already talked a little bit about floating and sinking, but we want to use density to actually determine whether something will float or sink. So before we get into floating and sinking, just a couple review questions. And the first is, what actually is matter? So remember back to our previous video, matter is the stuff that makes up our world. And so it's all the stuff that makes up our world. The chair you're sitting on, the paper that you're looking at, the computer screen that you're looking at, all made out of matter. And remember that matter is not a solid object. So if we look at this box right here, a cube, it's not a solid cube, but instead is made up of many, many little particles tightly packed together that actually come together and make our cube. So that is what matter is. So the next thing I want to look at is what is density, and it's applying this idea that matter is made up of particles, and it's just thinking about the compactness of the particles in matter. So if something has a lot more particles for a given space, that's going to be a lot more dense. If it has fewer particles that are less compacted together, it's going to be less dense. And so remember, density equals mass over volume. Mass over volume. That was our equation. So we have two cubes here, one here and one here. And let's just consider which one is more dense. They are both the same size or volume, so they're both the same volume, but this cube has a lot more particles. If it has more particles, it's going to have a higher mass, so it's more mass for the same volume, so this is going to be more dense, and this one is going to be less dense. And this makes sense because, remember, density is all about compactness. So if we just take a look at these, they're the same size cube. This one has a lot more compact particles than this one, therefore this one over here is going to be more dense. Basic review of density. Now I want to move on to how to determine if something floats or sinks. So let's first take a look at this, and you can see here I have a beaker of water. Let's just call it water for now, but it could be any liquid. And I have a cube on top. And so we want to figure out, is this cube going to sink down to the bottom, or is it just going to stay up on top of this liquid? And it all comes down to density. So now let's take a look at this first example, example A. So if we take a look at the cube and we take a look at the liquid, I just want you to consider which one is more dense. So remember, density is compactness. So you can see the particles here, and I want you to consider which is more dense. Is it the cube or is it the liquid? And hopefully you took a look and you saw that the cube has more particles in a smaller space, therefore the cube is going to be more dense. So the solid is going to be more dense. And so what's going to happen to that box? If it's more dense, it is going to sink right down to the bottom. Now let's consider cube B. Take a look. Is the cube or is the liquid more dense? And hopefully you said that the liquid is more dense because it has more compact particles than the solid does. So in the last example, example A, the cube was more dense and sank to the bottom. But in this case, the liquid is more dense, so the cube will just sit right on top, so that what will happen to the box? It will float. So whichever material is more dense goes on the bottom. Whichever material is less dense goes on the top. And that's how we can determine whether something will sink or float. So in this case, the cube is more dense, sinks to the bottom. In this case, the cube is less dense, so it will float on top of the liquid.